How's it going, everyone? As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. This is PSReady, my channel all about PlayStation. In today's video, I'm working back down to 3 topics because there's some actual big PlayStation news out that's worth talking about. The first one is how PlayStation has a 500% lead over Xbox right now. The second one is that Sony has allocated $11 billion to acquisitions and new games. And the third one is a great new update to an app that'll allow you to build your own PlayStation portal. So let's jump into this first news story, which is being pulled from the end of fiscal year 2023, which just happened. We got the data from Xbox, we got the data from PlayStation, and it is very revealing. I mentioned this 2 videos ago, but as it currently stands, PlayStation is down in hardware by about 29%. We're going to get into that later in this topic and explain why it's not actually bad. And the Xbox is down around 31%. But when you look at the raw numbers, like the amount of consoles that were shipped, it really paints a completely different picture. So in the last quarter, which I'll remind you covers the biggest part of the year for selling consoles, Sony was able to move around 4.5 million PlayStation 5s, which is a really healthy number of PlayStation 5s to sell. Xbox, on the other hand, was only able to sell around 800,000 Xbox Series X and S's, which people are kind of painting a picture here that Jim Ryan was a little bit prophetic. At the beginning of the generation, he said that when you put out a console like the Xbox Series S, which is underpowered compared to what you have with the Series X or the PlayStation 5, generally those don't tend to do well and they just cause more problems than they're worth. That's clearly what's happening here. Like at the beginning of the generation, the Series S was selling really well. It seemed like a great thing to pick up at $350, but just like with underpowered devices like the Nintendo Switch, as time goes on, people get more and more frustrated with the lower spec and they don't like the way games are running. You know, lower resolutions, lower frame rates, just bigger problems across the board. And then when it comes to the Series X and to some extent the PS5, there's just not a lot of first-party output from Microsoft with games that people actually want to play on these consoles. If you don't have a game you want to play on a console, you're probably not going to go pick it up. That's why Sony is so dominant over the PS3 late half and the whole PS4 generation. They've been building this massive library of amazing first-party games. Phil Spencer has always said it's not about making good games. That's not what drives console sales. I just disagree with that completely because that's what happened. The PlayStation ecosystem put out really good games and they were rewarded for it by people buying PlayStation consoles, and that train does not seem to be stopping. Now, because of this absolutely dismal amount of Xbox consoles that have been moved in that last quarter, which again, I'll remind you is the biggest time of the year for console sales, Xbox is apparently going like full nuclear and deciding to port even more games over to PlayStation. A lot of the big pundits who you can kind of rely on, like Jez Corden over at Windows Central, basically said that games you expect to see are games you're going to see by the end of the year. Stuff like Halo, the Master Chief Collection, maybe even Starfield, Indiana Jones, these bigger titles that Xbox had on their slate. I'm honestly kind of bummed about this as just an enjoyer of games. You know, I am a PlayStation fanboy at the end of the day, but when it really comes down to it, I just like good games. I think the reason I've stayed on PlayStation so long is because of the great games. I want Xbox to be competitive, and it seems like once again, I know it just keeps happening, they're on the cusp of doing some great stuff with games like Indiana Jones coming out later this year. We've seen it evolve, and as one person put it anonymously to Ryan McCaffrey over at IGN, it's no longer Xbox gaming, it's Microsoft gaming. We got to see where this ends up, but it really does look like Xbox is just trending to become a third-party publisher that publishes on Nintendo, Xbox consoles that are made for a more boutique audience, and of course the PlayStation 5, and of course PC. As to why PlayStation sales are down though in the hardware perspective, again, it's because there just aren't any first-party games. We've had games coming out from PlayStation's little banner of third-party and second-party exclusives like Rise of the Ronin, Stellar Blade, and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, but as we've seen time and time again, those don't do a great job of moving consoles. Those do a good job keeping people who already own a PlayStation 5 playing on their PlayStation 5. So that almost assuredly is going to be remedied when we get the showcase at the end of the month where we get to see the future of PlayStation. I'm not so much concerned with that. What I really want to dig into here is the raw numbers and why that 29% drop that we're seeing with PlayStation hardware really isn't that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. You guys know, before I go into this, I'm terrible with numbers. It is not my strong suit. So if I mess up something small, please don't crucify me in the comments. But this time I wrote it down very simple so I can just read it and get the numbers right. So to understand these numbers, you have to look back a full year to fiscal year 2022's fourth quarter when PlayStation finally fixed their whole issue where they couldn't get PlayStation 5s into people's hands. And during that time period, they sold a whopping 6 million PlayStation 5. So that number of hardware sale decline is actually a decline from that versus what would be a normal year where the PlayStation was selling a regular amount for the entire generation. You would see it kind of rise as the console comes out, then it would kind of plateau and then eventually taper off. In the past, they would kind of fix that by making the consoles cheaper, but as we've heard, we don't expect the PlayStation 5 Slim to be any cheaper when the PS5 Pro comes out, because unlike previous generations, hardware components are not getting any cheaper. So Sony can't cut the price and actually keep their, either break even profit that they would get on a PlayStation 5, or as we see in this generation, actual profit, because we know that they're not selling the PlayStation 5 at a loss. So just for added context, that drop of 29% isn't the biggest deal in the world, because they dropped from 6.3 million PS5 shipped last year, as in 2022's holiday season, to around 4.5 million PS5 shipped this year, which is great. And the numbers get even better for Sony and the PS5 when you compare the numbers directly to the PlayStation 4. The best holiday season the PlayStation 4 ever had was moving 3.1 million units, whereas this time around we're moving 4.5. So the numbers are actually higher. The only reason the PS5 is tailing the PS4 right now and the PS4 is ahead in total sales is because of that game of catch up Sony had to play. The PS4 was hard to get when it came out, but it was nowhere near as hard to get as the PS5 was, and it was nowhere near as hard to get for as long as the PS5 was. So Sony currently is playing catch up. So as the generation goes on and we have things like the PlayStation 5 Pro, or we get that price cut a little bit later on than we normally would, which I think will probably happen, that's when we'll start to see the PS5 pulling ahead and eventually selling more units than the PlayStation 4, which is what we want here. We want console sales to grow at the end of the day, not stay stagnant or, God forbid, fall. And what's going to account for that increase in shipped consoles is, of course, the PS5 Pro, the PS5 Slim being out there for people who want to spend a little less money, and big first-party games from all of Sony's big first-party studios. As always, we're going to see those coming out in the later gen. Hopefully it won't be an Xbox situation where we see these games announced this year and then they slowly, quietly shift to PS6 games. Thankfully, with Sony's track record, I don't think we have anything to worry about there. I think any game that we get announced at this showcase will most likely, like 99% positive is what I am, be shipped on the PlayStation 5. So while on paper, a 29% drop isn't good, and I've seen people saying, why aren't people coming at this as hard as they did when Xbox had a similar drop the quarter before? The reason is context. A 29% drop means a lot more to Xbox than it does to PlayStation, because Xbox is so dramatically far behind in terms of console sales. Like 5-to-1 is the ratio that the PS5 is outselling the Xbox Series consoles, and that's just abysmal. There's really no way to put it. Whereas with Sony, they're dropping, but it's because they're dropping from an extremely high number of consoles from people being able to get them finally to a more reasonable number that's still outpacing the last generation, whereas the Xbox in most quarters is on par or below what the Xbox One was selling, which I just personally don't get. In the last generation, it made sense because the Xbox One was underpowered and you pair that with the lack of first-party games, but this generation, they've had a little bit better quality games, maybe not as many quality games, but the hardware, at least the Xbox Series X, is extremely good. I have a Series X. I have no problems when I do have a game to play on it. It is a powerful console, and as the generation went on, we have started to see games running better on the Series X. So I just don't get it. People just aren't showing up for Xbox. The only thing I can really point to is the fact that Xbox really does seem like they're becoming a third-party publisher, which again just makes the PS5 the best console you could ever pick up. And the icing on the cake for Sony here is that Matt Piscatella, the guy who runs Circana, which used to be NPD Group, it's kind of like the best tracking metric site that you have when it comes to game and console sales. He's saying that the PS5 is actually 7% ahead of the PS4. Again, I expect that gap to rise when we get more quality games from PlayStation's first-party studios. So, you're going to see a lot of doom and gloom from the usual suspects, but as far as I'm concerned, PlayStation is doing just fine, and even with the lack of games, people are still showing up. 4.5 million consoles moved last holiday is nothing to sneeze at. They obviously just had their projections set to a rate that was more similar to what they saw in 2022 when the PS5 became more available. I mean, expecting to sell 6.5 or whatever million consoles at a holiday season, that's kind of crazy. Anyway, that brings us to our second news story, which is all about mergers, acquisitions, and first-party games. Sony is going full force in the next 3 years with a big chunk of money dedicated to buying not only studios, but making, as Herman Hulse put it, richer, more expansive games, which is exactly what we want. So this is a little bit of a risk for Sony for sure, because if you compare the way they've traditionally done things to the way Microsoft is doing things and has done things, their strategies are completely different. Xbox's strategy is to look for a studio like Activision or Bethesda, where they're not really in the best financial status, they're looking to sell, and then they just throw so much money out there as an offer that someone like Sony, Take-Two, or really anyone else with a big reserve of cash just genuinely can't compete. And through that, they've gotten franchises like Call of Duty, Fallout, Elder Scrolls, you know, the list goes on and on of storied franchises that they didn't build that they just now own and are hoping to make money off of through game sales and Game Pass subscriptions. Sony, on the other hand, there are definitely a couple of outliers, but it really is just a couple. Their strategy in the past and going into the present day has always been to work with the studio, and then once they release a few quality games under the Sony banner, Sony will make an offer to purchase them, which then gives them money to expand the budget on their games and also hire more people to either get their games out quicker or have enough people to support that bigger vision for their games. Sony is definitely backed into a corner here, just like they were with the whole Game Pass thing. They kind of reacted to that by making PS Plus Extra and Premium, which I still think was a really bad idea, but like with the options presented, I think it was the best possible way to do it. This corner that they're backed into is that if they don't buy studios, Xbox could just show up one day and buy them, because with Xbox kind of transitioning their strategy from being a hardware maker and making games to sell hardware, now they're more of a third-party publisher that wants to sell games, and that is not good for Sony, because if Xbox is selling third-party games, they have to give 70% of the profit they make off those games to Xbox. Sony only keeps 30% of the profit when they sell a game on their store or physically. So with that in mind, I hope Sony doesn't follow the Microsoft philosophy and start looking for studios that are in trouble that they can kind of, for lack of a better word, save. They most recently tried that with Bungie, and I'd argue they got fleeced in that deal. Not only is Bungie kind of running as its own little entity over underneath the Sony umbrella, their games are not first party, they're not like only on PlayStation and PC, they also release on Xbox. So under the Bungie umbrella, Sony is technically a third-party publisher when it comes to them. Also, the big reason I think Sony got fleeced on this deal is because when they bought Bungie, Destiny was arguably at its peak, and then just a few months later, it kind of fell off because of the Lightfall expansion, which got me, a diehard Destiny player with over 1,000 hours in the game, to just fully drop off. I tried to go back. I think the new content is fun, but that game really just feels like a full-time job now, and I feel like a lot of other people with the wealth of games that we have to play on our PlayStation 5s right now obviously feel the same way. They don't expect the final shape to actually sell up to the standard that they want it to. Marathon is being completely reworked into a hero shooter. Like, Bungie is a complete mess, and I don't want to see that repeated by Sony buying another studio that's in trouble, right? Like, I want them to just find more studios to work with outside their umbrella, actually make some games with them, and if those games are high quality and sell well on PlayStation, then come in and offer them some money to make bigger games in the future. So with that in mind, what studios could they pick up? Well, the first and most obvious one that I think they could go for is the parent company of From Software. A lot of people don't know that From Software isn't an independent studio. They have a parent company over in Japan that really only works with From Software, and that would be a great get for Sony, because if you remember, they've already pumped a bunch of money into that publisher who owns From Software. My brain just broke there, I'm sorry. Another example of a great studio Sony could pick up following their old strategy is the developer of Stellar Blade. That's not really a third-party exclusive because Sony actually bought the IP off of them, so it's a second-party game because they're paying the developer to make the game they came up with, but at the end of the day, they own it. That game sold really well, it reviewed really well. There's obviously sequel want from people with that game, like people want to see where it goes. It's resonating really well with PlayStation users. I feel like that's a slam dunk purchase in terms of what Sony could pick up at this point. And since they've only really put out this one game, they could be bought relatively cheap and then expanded out with more money and more employees to make a bigger, more expansive and more next-gen feeling game down the line, you know? Another example that I'm a little bit 50-50 on is Koei Tecmo, who own Team Ninja, the people who made Nioh, Nioh 2, and Rise of the Ronin. I think those games have performed well, obviously as PlayStation 5 exclusives that eventually all made their way to PC, except Rise of the Ronin because that just came out. But the issue is, I don't think any of those games, even though they are extremely good, I've played all three of them, they're just like not up to par with what we expect from the Sony first party. But even if Sony bought all three of those publishers that I just mentioned, I don't know if that would fully cover the $11 billion. So with the leftover money, I think their smartest move would be to take it and infuse it into the studios they already own to get them more staff, get them more organization, get them more just money overall to make more quality games and really show us why we were smart to pick up the PS5 for $500 when it came out, because the classic saying goes, every game that we've gotten this generation pretty much has been a cross-gen game, and we haven't really seen the PS5 be pushed to its absolute limit just yet. So with that $11 billion, the three best bets I think Sony has right now, keeping their old strategy that's worked forever in mind, are the parent company of From Software. I think that's a slam dunk. Nail down Elden Ring 2 as a PS5 and PC exclusive. That will move hardware more than pretty much any game out there at this point. Second, of course, is the developers of Stellar Blade. You already own the IP, give them more money to make an even bigger and better sequel. And in third place, which I'm kind of wishy-washy on, is Koei Tecmo. Maybe the strategy there is to invest a little bit more into their next game, give them a little bit more resources to work with, hopefully resonate more with the PlayStation audience, and give them a little bit more of a marketing budget to see if they can really grow effectively. And if that works out, then add them to the list as a potential pickup for studios. Anyway, that brings us to the third story in today's video, which is a great update to the app Chiaki for Deck, which, if you didn't know, it's the app that you can use on the Steam Deck that allows you to just basically make it a PlayStation Portal. This app, as I always say, is mainly geared for people who already own a Steam Deck or a PC and have an ecosystem and library already built out on Steam, because the Steam Deck is at minimum, I think, like $400 or more. And of course, the PS Portal is half the price at $200. So it's not worth buying a Steam Deck just to be able to do this. But the app got a great feature recently that really just puts it in line with the PlayStation Portal. And if you have at least a Steam Deck OLED, I think it makes it a better option than the PlayStation Portal. The biggest thing that this update brings is the ability to just connect to your PS5 from the PlayStation Network. Before, you'd have to port forward, which involved getting a key from a website, and it's a little bit more work than I think most people want to do. Now you can just fire up the app and connect directly to your PlayStation without messing around, which again makes it work pretty much exactly the same as a PlayStation Portal. And then another cool feature they've just added is that if your PS5 is running a game at a higher resolution than your screen, which would be like 100% of the games on the PlayStation 5 if we're talking about the Steam Deck, because both the OLED and the regular LCD Steam Deck are running at 800p, now you'll have a zoom in feature or zoom out feature. You can pinch in the game and run it at a higher resolution internally, and it'll display much crisper on your 800p screen because it's a clearer quality image coming in from the network remote play session. And the best part is this app is free. That was kind of like the big cool caveat for the little bit of difficulty you used to have to go through to actually get it set up. Now it's simpler than ever and it's free, so you can basically turn your Steam Deck into a PlayStation Portal. If you already have one, you should definitely set this up. If you're deciding between the PS Portal and the Steam Deck, I think the PS Portal would be the way to go just because of the price. You can get it for like 150 open box at Best Buy around the country, and they'll even ship it. But if you want to get into PC gaming, I cannot recommend the Steam Deck enough. I spend a lot, like probably half my game time on the Steam Deck. After I'm done playing a game on PS5 and I go up to bed, I play a game every night on my Steam Deck, and I absolutely love it. Anyway, guys, that's all I've got for you today. As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Have a great weekend and shape on.